So here we are talking. This is a contemporary issue. I mean, I even saw this kind of in the presidential debate slightly, because now I'm old enough to remember in the schools where sex education was the plumbing lecture, where in middle school they separated boys and girls and showed them, now this shows you how old I am, film strips. Okay, which was the plumbing lecture, and then from film strips we went to film and then video, still separate, and it was the plumbing lecture. And then it was, if there was a conversation, it was usually driven by a probably evangelical fundamentalist Christian framework of don't do it till marriage, like, right, that works just like alcohol does. Everybody's waiting till 21. Right, so people operating in the absence of information. So when I talk about community-defined evidence, and in cultures of tradition that are older than America and older than Western civilization, what they do is they start the conversation just before puberty. And it's skill-based to the degree that they have skill, and science-based to the degree that they have science, which is, we know that heterosexuals getting together can get pregnant. All right? So some folks will do, for example, so I'm talking about from a substance abuse prevention point of view. One of the reasons, okay, that this is a recovery issue is because along with the selling of sex for products, is this absence of information or conversation or skill building around this. And so what happens is people will get loaded and have sex. So even in movies, you rarely have sober sexual portrayals. People are usually, having a martini or getting stoned and going to Lover's Leap or whatever. So when people get clean and sober, when you're loaded, that's not always the best sexual outcome, one way or the other, rape or not, even if it's consensual. People have a lot of guilt around that. Guilt means they're not going to be thinking clearly about it, and they'll shy away from the topic. And so when people get clean and sober, one of the things that they find is, I don't know how to have a clean and sober relationship, where we actually talk about stuff. Right? Somebody asked me why did I start off with talking about, for example, a few weeks ago when I talked about 75% of the women we had in treatment had been sexually abused, and why did you go into that long litany of statistics about that? Because it's happening. And so what people do as a result of that was their use patterns will be about that. So they never learn how to have a conscious, healthy, sober relationship because they ain't had one. And where do you go to relationship school? Right. Where do you go to relationship school? How do you begin, sustained, and end a relationship consciously without pain and rancor and all that kind of stuff? Right. So we don't have relationship school. So when you have people getting into cyclical bad relationships, because, when I talk about joking, only halfway jokingly, you need an upgrade in your picker software. Because you keep picking and replicating the same addicted, abusive person. And even if that's you, how do you have a sober relationship? How do you do that? So that isn't part of the talk, right? So when people get clean and sober, they haven't had this talk, so they've often had to reinvent the wheel that was invented tens of thousands of years ago when we actually had people trained and they went through rites of passage that were appropriate for their society, where they had the sex talk by older women of the tribe if they're girls. And the men had one too. Here's what you want in a partner. Here's what here's how you please them on both sides. Here's how you consciously conceive or not, or prevent pregnancy without barrier methods. The technology existed to do that in cultures of tradition. We've lost that here with all our technology. Now I can say as a parent, did I want I'm a father of daughters, did I want my kid having sex at 15? No. Where's my shotgun? Right? Yes, I'm a knuckle dragger in that sense. But oldest daughter, took her then boyfriend to Planned Parenthood. They got an AIDS test, other HIV tests. She looked at her range of contraceptive options and decided on Depo-Provera. She talked with her aunt, my sister, who's an OBGYN. She says, look, if you do that, your cycle's not going to start really well when you go off. You could get pregnant. It could, screw up your ability to have kids. I don't want to have kids because she worked in her mom's child care. So doing child care is actually excellent contraception sometimes. However, all right, so years later, she's doing training to become a doctor. So, okay, that was an optimal outcome, great. But, having the talk, had more of a talk, didn't really have the chance to do the talk, but she absorbed the lesson in any case, which is not always optimal. So the reason I'm starting here, this talk, is basically many people's attitudes are informed by their religious upbringing or not religious upbringing. So my question often when I look at from a scientific public health point of view is why is it that, so for example, not to put you down if you're Catholic, but how is it you're taking sex advice from somebody who's celibate? How is that working for you? Rarely in outside of the Catholic Church in terms of looking at if your attitudes are coming from your church, where are the healthy representations of what sexuality are if you're coming from a scriptural basis? So in terms of looking at, that's why I'm starting there, because you need to examine that as a model, if that's what you're using as a model. Because we're in the 21st century now. And that doesn't mean we throw our religion out the window, but it means that we do know some things that weren't present, when those scriptures were created thousands of years ago. I'm just saying. So, ancient scriptures like, for example, the 42 Declarations of Innocence, or the Principles of Mott, which are basically the pre-runners to the Ten Commandments. I teach ethnic studies, so I know that. Moses was raised as Pharaoh's grandson, and as Pharaoh's grandson, he would have gotten the 42 Principles of Mott, because Judaism didn't exist as a separate entity then. So if you look at the Ten Commandments, they're contained within the 42 Principles of Ma'at. The Upanishads, which are quoted in the Kama Sutra, okay? The Bible, the Quran, among others. So in Scripture, okay, you can work now, right? Okay, from a 21st century point of view, ancient scriptures tell us more what not to do than what to do. And the texts that have been allowed to exist, and when I mean allowed to exist, I mean some of them have been suppressed. So for example, just talking about this yesterday in ethnic studies. Adam's first wife. So Adam had a wife before Eve. It's referred to in Genesis. Male and female created he them. Before all of a sudden Adam is... So that's like in Genesis 1. Male and female created he them. And then all of a sudden Adam's alone and Eve is being made from his rib. How is that different? Well, that was edited out. So the original Jewish scriptures that talked about several different versions of a creation story in Genesis, in which, in many of them, Adam and Lilith were created together out of clay. And because they were equal, Lilith wanted to be on top sometimes. I'm not making this up, this is from the scripture, right? So when we talk about cultures of tradition encountering Christians for the first time, and the missionaries are saying, oh, you're having sex the wrong way, okay, well, show me where in the Bible it says that you're supposed to do the missionary position, and how did the missionary position even become the missionary position? Oh, well, because woman is supposed to submit to man. Right? Even in your phrase, what you said, to get over somebody, you have to get under somebody. Really? Okay, where did that come from? All right? So, Lilith and Adam. Adam and Eve's 5 kids. Cain and Abel, twin daughters, Seth. So basically that story was that Cain and Abel's beef was not about that one had better sacrifices than the other, but one was in love with his sister and killed Abel because of that, to end that rivalry. Well, let's edit that out because that's incest. Did Jesus have at least one kid with Mary Magdalene? What about Jesus' brothers and sisters? So I know you've seen The Matrix, the Merovingian, that's an actual sect in France that believe they worship the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene's kid. But that's not part of mainstream Christianity. So how does this stuff, who decides what's in, what's out, and what does that say in terms of the deletion? Why don't we talk about that? Because all these issues are often contemporary issues in terms of taboos and taboo subjects. So what not to do rather than what to do. Okay? So the text that still exists, so that's the stuff that's been edited out that you can still get as books today. So that's only why I'm referencing to them, and if you're interested, I can get you that. But the text that still exists point to a reverence for spiritual forces which can be expressed sexually, whether to create new life, create a stronger relationship, create art, create music, create stronger bonds between families and groups. Now, as Homo sapiens, whether you believe in evolution or not, I'm a scientist, so I do. Our genome is set up so that we don't come into heat. Like dolphins, we can be sexual all the time without resulting in pregnancy in a variety of combinations. Right? So, you evolve a sensibility that takes that into account. And there are religions that do take that into account. Okay? So, Scripture is what you've been allowed to see and allowed to know about. So, in Western Christianity, for example, it was a death sentence to read and particularly attempt to read the Bible if you were a poor person at one point. At the time the king... Huh?
Well, I was thinking the same thing was true about slaves.
Sure. But I'm talking about before there's an America. I'm talking about like the King James Version of the Bible. Yeah. If you were a poor person, they killed you for trying to read it in England. So, KJV. So you also weren't allowed to know about anything else, even in America. So the text that still exists point to a reverence for spiritual forces. So they're creative forces. So whether create new life, create a stronger relationship, or art. So for example, Scripture is words written by human beings attributed to non-human beings like angels, God, gods, etc. So as an example, I'll just continue on. Scripture can and has been translated, edited, misinterpreted, misused towards the ends of men. So you expect at least expect problems when translating from one language to another and another and another, as which has happened with King James Version, among other things, and the Quran and any of those books. Expect problems when your enemies translate your scriptures for your own ends. For example, Yeshua, Jesus, as you know him, his Greek name, did not speak Latin or English. So there are words in Latin and English that are not concepts in his native language, Aramaic. Aramaic-speaking Christians, again, never led armies, never enslaved people, never burned witches, never colonized by conquest, or devised schemas of racial supremacy by obscuring the African roots of Christianity, which is a whole separate class, but effectively it's different. The Romans were not from Africa, so they didn't speak Aramaic. So, for example, there are clear distinctions. So that, being that as it may, when I say Christianity, for example, is an African religion, in other words, from the East, but the form that you're familiar with is from the West, and Jesus never had armies, never killed anybody. How do you have Christian soldiers? How do you have crusades if that's not specifically there? And then what we talk about so if we start with the Egyptian state religion. You had a question?
Well, yeah, I was just going to ask. I know in English, at least, if you read something from a long time ago, still in English, it's almost undecipherable if you don't know
Right.
that. Are other languages like that too?
Yes.
Okay.
Sure.
So they evolve quite a bit over time on top of being translated.
Right.
Okay.
So, for example, in English, so Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is a different form of English than Shakespeare, and they're only separated by a couple of centuries. And that's even different from, so the Shakespeare, which is essentially what King James Version is, thou and thee and thou mayest and etc., is different than what we're speaking today. So just in English, just as contemporary English is different from ancient English, so certainly contemporary Syriac, which is Aramaic, is different from ancient Aramaic too.